the greatest military power on earth, entered Vietnam, saying it had to stop the spread of communism, and it left in desperation. Helicopters evacuating the last Americans, allies abandoned, a capital on the verge of collapse. The whole world watched on television the downfall of a war that had once seemed impossible to lose. But Vietnam was not just a war. It was a trauma. It was a political wound. It was a human tragedy. It was a conflict that destroyed careers, split families apart, set universities on fire, shook governments, brought down presidents, and changed the way the world saw the power of the United States. Because in Vietnam, it was not enough to have more planes, more tanks, more bombs. In Vietnam, the enemy was not just an army. It was an idea. It was a cause. It was a war that had begun long before American troops ever arrived. And when the United States tried to control it, it ended up being consumed by it. Today, you will see how a colonial dispute became a civil war, how a civil war became a battlefield of the Cold War, and how that battlefield turned into one of the most brutal, most symbolic, and most traumatic conflicts of the 20th century. This is the story of the Vietnam War, from the beginning to the final collapse. When most people hear the phrase Vietnam War, they immediately think of helicopters, jungle, 60s rock, protests, napalm, and American soldiers walking in file through the trees. But this story does not begin in 1965 or in 1964. It begins much earlier. For decades, Vietnam had been part of what was known as French Indochina. To France, it was a colony. To the Vietnamese, it was occupation. The land was exploited. The economy was controlled. The population lived under submission. And, as so often happens in history, foreign rule fed an explosive mix of humiliation, anger, and a desire for independence. That desire began to take political form in the early 20th century. And one of the central figures in that process was Ho Chi Minh, a revolutionary, a nationalist, a communist, but above all, for millions of Vietnamese, a symbol of national liberation. During the Second World War, everything became even more chaotic. The Japanese occupation weakened the French presence in the region, and inside that power vacuum, the Viet Minh grew stronger, led by Ho Chi Minh, blending Vietnamese nationalism with communist organization. When the Second World War ended, the world entered another kind of conflict, the Cold War, and that changed everything, because Vietnam's struggle for independence stopped being seen as only a colonial issue. It also began to be treated as part of the great ideological confrontation of the 20th century. For many Vietnamese, it was a war for sovereignty. For France, it was a war to keep its empire. For the United States, increasingly, it was one more piece of the global struggle against communism. That is how the First Indochina War began. On one side, France. On the other, the Viet Minh. The French had structure. They had weapons. They had outside support. But the Viet Minh had time. They had terrain. They had discipline. They had motivation. And they had the conviction that they were fighting for their own independence. The war was long, hard, brutal, and as the years passed, it became clear that France was trapped in a conflict it could not win decisively. Then came the moment that would change the history of the region, Dien Bien Phu. In 1954, the French decided to consolidate a fortified position at Dien Bien Phu in northern Vietnam. The idea seemed logical from a military point of view. Build a strong base, draw the enemy in, force him into a conventional battle. But reality was different. Vietnamese General Vong Nguyen Giap turned the siege into a masterpiece of resistance and strategy. Artillery dragged through nearly impossible mountain trails, hidden positions, constant attacks, a determination the French had underestimated. Dien Bien Phu fell, and with it fell the illusion that France could still hold Vietnam by force. That was not just a military defeat. It was a political earthquake. It was a sign that European colonialism was bleeding out. It was a victory of an independence movement over an imperial power. And it was also the moment when the United States began looking at Vietnam with far more anxiety. Because now there was a question hanging in the air. If France had fallen, who would stop communism from advancing in that region? The answer would come soon after, at the negotiating table. And, ironically, the attempt to end that war would open the door to the next one, the far worse one. After Dien Bien Phu, the major powers met at the Geneva Conference in 1954. The goal was to end the fighting and find a political solution. On paper, it seemed possible. In reality, it was the beginning of a new fracture. Vietnam was divided into two zones. In the north, the government linked to Ho Chi Minh. In the south, a separate political structure, backed by anti-communist forces. The dividing line was, in theory, temporary. It was not supposed to become a permanent border. The plan called for national elections in 1956 to reunify the country, but the Cold War did not like simple solutions. The United States watched everything with deep concern. Washington believed Ho Chi Minh had a strong chance of winning any nationwide election, and within the logic of containment, that was seen as unacceptable. The so-called domino theory began to gain strength. If Vietnam fell, then Laos might fall, Cambodia might fall, maybe Thailand, maybe the entire region. So what was meant to be temporary began to harden. Thousands of people crossed the dividing line. Families were split apart. Entire communities were broken. Geography became ideology. The North consolidated itself under communist leadership. The South became increasingly dependent on outside political, economic, and military support. In practice, two competing visions of the country already existed. Two systems, two narratives, two rival claims to legitimacy. On one side, a government that presented itself as the heir to the anti-colonial struggle. On the other, a government that presented itself as a barrier against communism. And most importantly, each side believed it was the true Vietnam. That point is essential. The Vietnam War was not only a foreign intervention, it was also a Vietnamese war between Vietnamese, a civil war, a war over the legitimacy of the state itself. But that civil war was unfolding inside the larger chessboard of the Cold War, and that made it much more dangerous, much more violent, much more internationalized. While the North organized its political and military power, the South tried to build some kind of stability. But there was a huge problem. Building a state is already difficult. Building a state under fear, ideological polarization, outside dependence, and armed insurgency is even harder. That is when the name No Din Diem enters the story. Catholic, nationalist, anti-communist, conservative, and, for the United States at that moment, a possible pillar of South Vietnam. Diem took power and consolidated an authoritarian structure. His supporters saw him as necessary. His critics saw him as a leader disconnected from the rural population and deeply intolerant of opposition. He concentrated power, repressed his opponents, favored allies, and alienated major sectors of South Vietnamese society, including the Buddhists, who made up the majority of the population. The promise of a stable, legitimate anti-communist South was already beginning to rot from within, and that was exactly the kind of weakness the North knew how to exploit. While Washington tried to contain communism with government money, advisors, and strategic doctrine, the ground was showing something else. Without internal legitimacy, no regime would survive for long. The war that was coming would not be decided only by military divisions. It would also be decided by villages, by loyalties, by fear, by propaganda, by corruption, by intelligence, by patience, and by something the most powerful strategists in the world would underestimate again and again: the ability of a weaker enemy to survive longer. The United States wanted to turn South Vietnam into a showcase, an example, an outpost of anti-communist containment in Asia. But South Vietnam did not look like Washington's optimistic narrative. Beneath the surface, Diem's regime was piling up problems that only kept growing. He ruled in a centralized way, favored allies, repressed opponents, relied far more on coercion than on consensus. And in the countryside, the situation was even more delicate. Many peasants did not see the government in Saigon as a legitimate representative of their interests. The presence of the state was weak. Inequality remained. Corruption weighed heavily. Repression created resentment. The North understood early on that the war would not be won only with tanks or regular troops. It would also be won by infiltrating cadres, building networks, supporting insurgency, wearing down the Southern regime from the inside. It was in this context that the communist guerrilla movement in the South gained strength, tied to what the Americans and their allies would call the Viet Cong. Its goal was to undermine the government in Saigon, destroy its credibility, make the countryside ungovernable, and prove that the South was not a stable state, but a territory under permanent dispute. The United States responded with money, training, advisors, and counterinsurgency programs. But there was a structural problem. You can train soldiers, you can send advisors, you can design pacification plans, but you cannot manufacture legitimacy with foreign funding. And the more the internal war advanced, the more obvious Diem's erosion became. In 1963, the crisis exploded. The repression of Buddhists provoked outrage. Protests grew, and the world saw monks burning themselves alive. South Vietnam, which was supposed to look like a bastion of stability, now looked like an authoritarian regime that was out of control and morally compromised. In Washington, discomfort grew. The American leadership no longer had the same confidence in Diem. Then came the coup. Ngo Dinh Diem was deposed and killed in 1963 by South Vietnamese generals. For some, that was a course correction. For others, it was proof that the entire American policy up to that point had failed, because Diem fell. But instability did not fall with him. On the contrary, it grew. Governments followed one another quickly. Political authority became weaker. The Southern armed forces remained limited, and the Viet Cong kept gaining ground. This is one of the great ironies of Vietnam. The United States supported an authoritarian leader because it feared chaos. Then it accepted his removal because authoritarianism was creating chaos. But his removal created even more chaos. Every attempt to fix the problem seemed to deepen it. And in that same period, another event would shake the equation even more. In the United States, President John F. Kennedy would be assassinated in November 1963. The new president, Lyndon B. Johnson, would inherit an explosive situation, a fragile South Vietnam, a growing insurgency, a Cold War demanding firmness, and a constant fear that any retreat would look like global weakness. Johnson was not yet officially entering a full-scale war, but the road toward it was already open, and now it would be traveled at high speed. By 1964, the United States was already deeply involved in Vietnam, but there was still an important difference. Officially, the war was not yet fully American in the sense that it would become later. There were advisors, logistical help, military support, diplomatic pressure, but the great escalation had not yet happened. Then came the episode that changed everything, the Gulf of Tonkin. In August 1964, American destroyers reported attacks by North Vietnamese forces. The Johnson administration reacted quickly. It presented the case as aggression, asked Congress for support, and obtained the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. which gave the president broad authority to expand American military action in Southeast Asia. In practice, that became the political and legal foundation for the escalation of the war. But there was a crucial detail. Over time, serious doubts emerged about the second reported attack. In other words, the event that helped justify the expansion of the war was already surrounded by controversy from the beginning. Even so, the political decision had been made. Johnson and his team believed that retreat would be disastrous. They feared the domino effect. They feared the loss of credibility. They feared looking weak in the eyes of the Soviet Union, China, and allies around the world. And so the United States crossed a point of no return. In 1965, the phase of Americanization began. More intense bombing followed. Operation Rolling Thunder followed. More troops arrived. More helicopters. More bases. More deaths. In March 1965, the first American Marines landed at Da Nang. The image was powerful. The United States was no longer just supporting. Now it was fighting directly. And the logic seemed simple. With superior technology, air mobility, massive artillery, and enormous industrial capacity, the greatest power in the world would crush the enemy. But Vietnam did not obey the logic of conventional manuals, because the war in Vietnam was not a war with a clear front line. It was not a war with fixed lines. It was not a war in which taking a city meant winning. It was a war of attrition, of ambushes, of jungle, of tunnels, of fragmented information, of an invisible enemy. An American soldier could dominate the sky, but not necessarily the village next door. He could win direct engagements, but that did not mean controlling the territory politically. Very soon, in 1965, that reality would appear clearly at Ia Drang. Ia Drang was the first major clash between American troops and North Vietnamese forces. There, it became clear that the war would be hard, brutal, up close, and far more costly than many had imagined. The Americans drew lessons about helicopters, mobility, and air power. The North Vietnamese learned something else. If they could fight close to the enemy, they could reduce the advantage of air support and artillery. Each side came out of the battle with interpretations that reinforced its own strategy. And that is fundamental, because instead of discouraging the war, the first major clashes convinced both sides that victory was still possible. The United States believed that more force would solve it. Hanoi believed that more resistance would break American will. And so the conflict deepened. No one wanted to look weak. No one wanted to give in. No one wanted to leave defeated. But every month that passed made the human cost higher, and the horizon of victory more distant. Now the war was in full motion, and what it revealed, day after day, was a clash between two radically different ways of fighting. On one side, the United States and its allies, overwhelming firepower, helicopters, bombers, artillery, advanced communications, massive logistics. On the other, the Viet Cong and North Vietnam, guerrilla warfare, dispersion, camouflage, mobility, local support networks, knowledge of the terrain, the ability to disappear and reappear. The enemy rarely offered the decisive battle the Americans wanted. It attacked and vanished. It retreated, but often retreated while winning, because it forced the opponent to keep spending men, money, energy, and morale. In Vietnam, there was one decisive element: time. For the United States, time was a problem. Public opinion could grow tired. Elections kept coming. Costs kept rising. Coffins kept returning. For North Vietnam, time was an ally. If resistance stayed alive and American political will weakened, the balance could shift. The jungle became a character in the war, not as scenery, but as a weapon. Heat, insects, disease, bad visibility, hostile ground, nerves stretched at all times. At any step, there could be a trapdoor, a mine, An ambush, a shot fired from the trees. The war was also underground. Literally, the tunnels allowed fighters, weapons, supplies, command posts, and even makeshift hospitals to be hidden. The enemy could be under the ground, beside the road, inside the village, in the trees, in the water, in the rice fields. Everything felt threatening. Everything felt uncertain, and that eroded the mind. The United States tried to measure progress through statistics. Enemy dead, swept areas, pacified villages, captured weapons. But Vietnam was a war in which numbers could lie. An operation considered successful could be followed by enemy reoccupation a few days later. A village considered secure could change sides overnight. A region marked as controlled on the map could, in practice, be a territory with no stable loyalty. The war was also becoming increasingly televised. For the first time, a large part of American society saw the conflict enter the home almost in real time. Exhausted soldiers, burned villages, wounded people, civilians fleeing, crying children, columns of smoke. Official language kept talking about progress, but the images were starting to tell another story. This is where one of Vietnam's central tensions was born: the gap between what the government said and what the war seemed to show. On the ground, commanders were looking for results. In Washington, politicians were trying to preserve credibility. On television, the public was beginning to see doubt. And in Vietnam, people were dying every day. Americans, South Vietnamese, North Vietnamese, civilians. That is an essential dimension. The Vietnam War was not just a geopolitical duel. It was a human catastrophe. Destroyed villages, broken families, refugees, the wounded, permanent trauma. And even so, neither side seemed close to giving in, because each side believed the other would break first. The United States expected to crush resistance through constant pressure. Hanoi expected to survive the storm until American will gave way. In the middle of all of it, South Vietnam remained the weakest link. Without full political stability, without total cohesion, dependent on American support, the war stopped being the solution and became the problem itself. But the most decisive blow against American confidence was still ahead, and it would come in 1968. At the beginning of 1968, the American administration was still trying to sustain the idea that there was progress. The war was hard, losses were high, but the official discourse insisted that the enemy was being weakened. Then came Tet, the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, a moment associated with tradition, pause, and symbolism. And for that exact reason, the perfect moment for a shock. At the end of January 1968, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched a coordinated offensive against targets all across South Vietnam. It was not an isolated attack. It was an explosion of simultaneous attacks. Cities, bases, military installations, urban centers, places that had been considered relatively secure. The impact was seismic. Militarily, the communists suffered heavy losses. In many places, they were pushed back. They did not achieve the decisive victory they wanted. But politically, psychologically, and symbolically, the effect was devastating for the American narrative, because Tet proved something simple and terrible. The enemy was far from defeated. If communist forces could coordinate attacks on that scale, then the war was much farther from over than Washington had suggested. One of the most striking images came from Saigon, when fighters attacked the U.S. Embassy. It was not only the final tactical result that mattered. The image had already won. If even the American embassy could be hit, then what kind of real control existed? In Hue, the fighting was especially intense and destructive. The city became a scene of devastation, street by street, house by house, a brutal urban war inside a conflict many people associated only with the jungle. Tet was the moment when the war entered in an unavoidable way. The imagination collapsed. The American leadership said one thing. The facts seemed to say something else. And the public began to feel that with much greater force. Vietnam stopped looking like a hard war that could still be won. It started to look like a war without a clear end, without a clear truth, without a clear victory. And when public confidence begins to collapse inside a democracy, the entire nature of the war changes. Johnson felt the impact. The political costs exploded. Opposition to the war grew. American society became more polarized. And in that same year, another wound would explode in the public conscience. My Lai. In March 1968, American soldiers killed hundreds of Vietnamese civilians in the My Lai massacre. Women, children, elderly people, unarmed people. When the reports and images reached the public, the moral shock was enormous. My Lai became more than a crime. It became a symbol of what the war could do to the moral structure of an army, to the logic of command, and to the humanity of everyone involved. In a conflict with no clearly defined face, no clearly defined front, and no clear progress, brutality could overflow in monstrous ways. Now, it was not only a question of winning or losing. It was a question of what the United States was becoming in the process. Tet and My Lai together produced a massive shock. One was a strategic and psychological blow. The other was an ethical and moral blow. And both made it clear that Vietnam was no longer a distant war. It was an American national crisis. Under pressure, Johnson announced that he would not run for re-election. That decision alone shows the depth of the earthquake. The war in Vietnam was not only killing soldiers on the other side of the world, it was reshaping American politics itself. After Tet, the Vietnam War stopped being only a difficult military conflict. It became a political war inside the United States. Public confidence began to break at high speed, and that point is essential. In long wars, it is not enough to resist on the battlefield. You also have to sustain legitimacy. You have to convince society that the cost still makes sense. In Vietnam, that became harder and harder. Protests grew. Students took to the streets. Intellectuals criticized the war. Veterans came home marked by it, and often without real welcome. Families began asking what exactly was being defended. Television amplified everything. Images of the conflict reached the living room. Bodies, destroyed villages, exhausted soldiers, crying, panic, fire. The government no longer controlled the narrative by itself. Every image had political force. Every contradictory report fed doubt. Every new revelation deepened the sense that the truth was being hidden, polished, or distorted. It was in this environment that Vietnam also became a battle over reality itself. Who is winning? Who is lying? Who is paying the price? Who is dying? Who gets to decide how long this continues? These questions stopped circulating only inside political circles. They became a national debate. And at the center of it all was a growing perception that the war no longer matched the original promise. It was not short. It was not clear. It was not clean. It was not controllable. Vietnam also exposed deep fractures inside American society. Questions of class, questions of race, questions of generation, questions about authority, patriotism, duty, and disobedience. One part of the population saw opposition to the war as betrayal. Another saw the continuation of the war as madness. The country was tearing itself apart from within. That war at home was exactly the kind of indirect victory Hanoi needed, not because it controlled American protests, but because it understood something fundamental. If American public opinion collapsed, the political ability to sustain the war would shrink enormously, and that is what began to happen. The battlefield was in Southeast Asia, but resistance to the war was increasingly destroying its support structure in Washington. The Vietnam War was also the war that taught the world the political power of the image. A photograph could do more to shape public perception than an entire official statement. A televised scene could erode months of propaganda. A revelation published by the press could shake a presidency. That is one of the conflict's great legacies. After Vietnam, it would never again be so easy for democratic governments to imagine that they could wage long, expensive, ambiguous wars without facing the permanent court of public opinion. But at that moment, the United States was still not leaving the war. It was only changing the way it tried to win it. And the man who would step into that unstable ground was Richard Nixon. When Richard Nixon took office in January 1969, he inherited a war that had become a military, political, and moral minefield. He knew he had to reduce American involvement, but he also knew he did not want to look defeated. That tension would shape his entire strategy. Nixon's answer got a name: Vietnamization. The idea, in theory, was simple: gradually reduce the American troop presence, transfer the burden of combat to the South Vietnamese army, maintain pressure on the enemy, negotiate in Paris, and find an exit that preserved, at least in appearance, the honor and credibility of the United States. In practice, it was an almost impossible balancing act, because the South Vietnamese army still had serious limitations, and because at the same time Nixon spoke about withdrawal, he also authorized violent escalations. In the first months of his administration, there were secret bombings of communist bases in Cambodia. The logic was to pressure Hanoi and cut supply routes, but the political effect would be explosive. At the same time, the United States began pulling troops out, and that had enormous symbolic value. It was proof that the war could not continue indefinitely under the old model, but withdrawing men without losing the war was very different from simply boarding planes and going home. Nixon and Henry Kissinger pursued a dual strategy: negotiate in pressure, talk in Paris, and bomb in Southeast Asia, reduce troops, and maintain threat. In November 1969, Nixon gave his famous silent majority speech, asking the public to support the effort until an acceptable peace could be reached. It was an appeal for patience. But public patience was already wearing thin. Even so, Vietnamization moved forward. American troops left the country. South Vietnam took on more responsibility. And one major question hovered in the air: could the South survive without the United States fighting for it on a full scale? That question would become even more uncomfortable when the war spread more openly into Cambodia and Laos. In 1970, the war expanded even further. Cambodia's fragile neutrality collapsed. Nixon ordered an American and South Vietnamese incursion into Cambodian territory, claiming it was necessary to strike communist bases and sanctuaries near the border. From a military perspective, the operation had logic. From a political perspective, it was gasoline on the fire, because for millions of Americans, it looked like the exact opposite of what had been promised. The war was not ending. It was spreading. Universities erupted in protest. The feeling of betrayal deepened. American youth had already carried years of exhaustion, fear of the draft, and anger over the conflict. Now, the expansion into Cambodia pushed everything over the edge. And then came Kent State. On May 4th, 1970, during protests at the university, the National Guard killed 4 students. The image of the country was marked forever. The Vietnam War was not only killing in Southeast Asia, it was now spilling student blood on American soil. Kent State became a symbol of polarization, a symbol of fear, a symbol of the rupture between government and youth, a symbol of the country's inability to understand itself in the middle of the war. Nixon insisted that the incursion into Cambodia had produced real military results, buying time for Vietnamization and disrupting enemy structures. But the political cost was enormous. The war at home intensified. trust fell even further, and the presidency wore down along with the conflict. The following year, another deep blow hit the legitimacy of the war: the Pentagon Papers. The study, commissioned during Robert McNamara's era, documented the history of American involvement in Southeast Asia. When parts of it became public in 1971, they reinforced the perception that successive governments had misled the population about the war, its goals, and its real prospects. At that point, the fracture opened even wider. It was no longer just a badly conducted war. For many, it was a war sustained through deception, through distortion, through concealment, through rhetoric that did not match reality. The Pentagon Papers did not concern only the present. They rewrote the past. They showed that the crisis of trust had been building for a long time, and that is devastating for any war effort, because soldiers fight with weapons, but governments also fight with credibility. And in Vietnam, American credibility was dissolving. Even so, Nixon still believed it was possible to leave the conflict with some kind of honorable arrangement. The question was whether the battlefield would allow it. In 1971, the strategy of Vietnamization faced a severe test. Operation Lam Son 719 was designed to attack supply routes connected to the communist logistical system. The idea was to show that South Vietnamese forces could now execute complex operations with American support, but without large-scale direct U.S. ground combat. At its core, it was a showcase, a public demonstration of Nixon's policy. The result was harsh. South Vietnamese forces met intense resistance. The retreat was disorganized. Weaknesses in command, coordination, and sustainment were exposed. For Hanoi, the conclusion was clear. If the Americans left completely, the South would have enormous difficulty holding on by itself. For Washington, the situation was more ambiguous. It was still insisting that Vietnamization was working, but underneath that claim, it was already clear that the project depended on American air support, money, equipment, and political cover on a much larger scale than was being publicly admitted. This is another tragedy of Vietnam. The war produced narratives of partial success built on strategic structures that were becoming increasingly fragile. Every American withdrawal brought the political goal of leaving closer, but it also exposed the weakness of the ally that was supposed to remain. It was like building a bridge while it was already cracking. At the same time, North Vietnam held to its central bet: endure, wait, preserve forces, reorganize, strike at the right moment. The war was no longer the same one it had been in 1965, but its deeper logic remained intact. The United States was trying to find a formula for ending the conflict without the immediate collapse of the South. Hanoi was trying to prove that collapse was inevitable, and history was beginning, slowly, to tilt toward the side that was betting on long-term endurance. In 1972, Hanoi made a massive gamble. It launched the so-called Easter Offensive, a major conventional offensive on multiple fronts inside South Vietnam. It was an attempt to turn attrition into decision, apply military pressure, apply political pressure, and arrive at the negotiating table in a stronger position. The offensive showed that the war had changed form. It was no longer only guerrilla warfare. Now, there was also large-scale conventional movement. South Vietnam was placed under heavy pressure, and once again, the survival of the South depended heavily on American air power. Nixon answered with force. He sent air and naval reinforcements, ordered the mining of North Vietnamese ports, and launched Operation Linebacker, an intense air campaign. Combined with South Vietnamese defenses, those actions helped contain the offensive. Politically, that had major consequences. Hanoi realized that this might be the right moment to negotiate seriously. The talks in Paris gained new weight. Henry Kissinger and Le Duc, they'll move forward through secret understandings. But, as so many times in Vietnam, nothing was simple. South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu resisted any agreement that would leave North Vietnamese troops in the South and grant indirect legitimacy to the communist structure. In other words, the United States wanted out. Hanoi wanted strategic gains. Saigon wanted to survive. And each of those interests pulled the negotiations in a different direction. Even so, there was one unavoidable fact. The war was approaching a point where everyone was talking about peace, but no one trusted peace. In October 1972, it seemed that an agreement was close. Kissinger even said that peace was at hand, but President Thieu rejected the terms. He feared, with good reason, that the agreement would be nothing more than an interval before collapse. Hanoi was also applying pressure. Washington needed to close the issue without appearing to surrender. So, at the end of 1972, Nixon ordered the massive B-52 attacks that have become known as the Christmas bombing. It was a brutal demonstration of force, a military and diplomatic message. Pressure on Hanoi, pressure on Saigon, pressure on the negotiating table. After that, the talks resumed. On January 27, 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. On paper, that looked like the beginning of the end. A ceasefire, withdrawal of American forces within 60 days, dismantling of bases, return of prisoners of war. But there was one crucial point. No Vietnamese troops would be allowed to remain in the South. That detail was enormous. In practice, the United States had found a way out, but the central problem of Vietnam remained unresolved. There were two rival projects of power inside the same territory. Two armies, two claims to legitimacy, two irreconcilable visions. It was difficult to imagine that a signed document would solve that, and it did not. In March 1973, the last American combat troops left Vietnam. Inside the United States, there was relief. There was exhaustion. There was an attempt to close a wound. But in Vietnam, the war had not truly ended. It had only lost direct American ground combat participation. And now the final question came. Without American troops in the field, how long could South Vietnam survive? The Paris Peace Accords gave the United States an exit, but they did not give Vietnam real peace. The fighting continued. Accusations of violating the agreement emerged almost immediately. In practice, both sides remained testing each other, attacking each other, and preparing for the next phase. South Vietnam was now even more vulnerable, without American ground troops, dependent on outside aid, eroded by corruption, exhaustion, desertion, and morale problems. And in Washington, the political appetite to return with full force was almost non-existent. That is a decisive point. For years, Hanoi had tried to answer one question. Would the Americans come back in full force if we pushed too far? In 1974 and 1975, the practical answer began to become clear. No, the American political crisis, war fatigue, the Watergate scandal, the changing mood in Congress, and the exhaustion of society all sharply limited any willingness to resume the war on a major scale. So Hanoi tested the ground, and it saw weakness. Southern positions proved more fragile than many had expected. Resistance lacked consistency. The structure was rotting. And when a political military system depends for a long time on outside support to survive, the withdrawal of that support usually reveals everything that had been hidden. The South still had soldiers, still had weapons, still had cities, still had a government, but it no longer had the same base of confidence, nor the same international backing, nor the same certainty that someone would save it at the last moment. Then came the final offensive. In 1975, North Vietnam's final campaign advanced with devastating speed. South Vietnamese resistance began collapsing in sequence. Units retreated, positions were abandoned, cities fell, panic replaced order. The entire system seemed to be coming apart in front of the cameras. Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, became the stage for the most famous ending of the war. In April, the world watched the desperate evacuation. Helicopters carrying Americans and some allies, crowds trying to escape, rooftops packed, faces consumed by fear. It was a visual collapse of everything the United States had spent years trying to sustain. On April 30th, 1975, Saigon fell, and with it fell South Vietnam as a viable political entity. For Hanoi, It was the final victory of reunification under its control. For the United States, it was a historic defeat, even if not everyone used that word at the time. For the world, it was a landmark. The war that had consumed decades of political, military, and moral energy ended with the image of a retreat. And few images are as powerful in geopolitical history as that of a superpower leaving in haste from a war it could not win. But the fall of Saigon was not only a symbol for Americans, it was also an immense human drama for the Vietnamese. People tied to the old regime, military personnel, civil servants, families, terrified civilians, people trying to flee, people who did not know what was coming, people who had no choice. The victory of one side was also the beginning of a new phase of fear, authoritarian reorganization, displacement, and rupture for many on the other side. That has to be remembered, because wars do not end only when the last shot is fired. They continue inside people, in memory, in trauma, in exile, in guilt, in absence, in everything that never becomes normal again. The Vietnam War ended officially on the battlefield, but its echoes continued for decades. Millions of Vietnamese were affected by the war, directly or indirectly. Tens of thousands of Americans died. Many more returned alive, but not whole. Psychological trauma, permanent injuries, addiction, difficulty reintegrating, silence, nightmares, guilt, rage, moral confusion. The war also left Vietnam devastated. Destroyed infrastructure, broken communities, contaminated land, entire generations shaped by suffering and loss. In the United States, the impact was immense. Trust in institutions was shaken. The relationship among government, press, and public opinion changed. The idea that superior military power could guarantee political victory suffered a profound blow. Vietnam taught a hard lesson. You can dominate the sky and still lose the war. You can win battles and lose legitimacy. You can have more technology and less understanding. You can be stronger and still be unable to bear the political cost of continuing. Vietnam also marked the Cold War. It showed that local conflicts could become arenas of global competition with enormous consequences. It showed the limits of containment when applied to deeply complex historical, social, and national realities. It showed that calling everything simply communism did not explain everything. There was nationalism. There was anti-colonialism. There was civil war. There was geopolitics. There was identity. There was the memory of foreign occupation. And ignoring that complexity came at a high price. Beyond that, Vietnam reprogrammed the way the United States would think about future interventions. For a long time, the so-called Vietnam Syndrome hovered over American foreign policy. Fear of entering long wars, fear of quagmires, fear of conflicts with no clear victory, fear of domestic erosion, fear of repeating the past. But perhaps Vietnam's deepest mark is something else. The fact that it forces any serious person to look at war without romanticism, without simplification, without cheap propaganda. Because in Vietnam, the distance between discourse and reality was enormous. Between strategy and consequence, enormous. Between declared goals and final outcome, enormous. It was a war that consumed those who directed it, consumed those who fought it, and consumed, above all, those trapped in the middle of it. The war ended. The trauma did not. The Vietnam War was not only the story of an American defeat, nor only the story of a communist victory. It was a story of how empires, ideologies, ambitions, and fears can crush entire peoples. It was the story of a war that began as a struggle for independence, became a civil war, was absorbed into the Cold War, and ended as a global symbol of the limits of military power. It was a story of a conflict in which each side claimed to be fighting for freedom, for survival, for legitimacy, for the future, but one in which millions of people were left without a present. And maybe that is why Vietnam still haunts us so deeply, because it reminds us that war is almost never what its architects promise. It grows, it escapes, it changes form. It costs more than anyone expected, and when it ends, it leaves questions that remain open. How much is an ideal worth? How much does a strategic illusion cost? How long can people endure? How long can democracy sustain a war without understanding why it is still there? And above all, how many times will humanity repeat the same mistake before admitting that power is not the same thing as control? Vietnam ended in 1975, but its echo is still here. In every debate about intervention, in every distrust of governments at war, in every memorial, in every veteran, in every family, in every image of a helicopter rising from a rooftop while the whole world watches. To understand Vietnam is to understand a part of the 20th century that still lives inside our present. Thank you for staying with us until the end. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in the next chapter of history.